Hi, everyone. This is Brian Trupeck here from DigiCert. We're here today to talk about freeware CAs, why they're not free, and some of the common challenges and misconceptions that we all see out there. So we'll kind of jump into the slides here. Let me share and get things started. Okay, so today we're, intro of myself. So I'm Brian Trupeck. I'm the Senior Vice President of Product at DigiCert. So all of our wonderful PKI-based products, report up under me. And we're delighted this morning to have Andrew Mccullough, a special guest here from DXC Technology, to join us. Andrew's got some deep expertise in PKI. Andrew, do you want to say hi and maybe just give a quick intro on yourself?
Sure, Brian. So, Andrew Mccullough, I work for DXC Technology Security Consulting Services. I've been a consultant with DXC for about the last 8 years. Been in IT and information security for almost 20 now. And one of the few people on earth who actually loves PKI and encryption. So,
well, we've got two of those people here now, unfortunate for everyone watching. So let's, thanks Andrew for joining us. Thanks DXC for lending Andrew to us for the morning here. And let's jump in and start our talk. So on a quick view of the agenda, we just want to talk about what are the challenges for building, managing, and maintaining and caring for PKI. And the way we're going to structure it is kind of a story where we've taken bits and pieces of many kind of customer interactions we've seen. So it's a bit of a contrived story, but to kind of show what growth looks like and what happens at different stages of growth. And we're going to be able to weave in some kind of lessons learned and things we've seen from actual people doing it out there, and just look at the challenges that you face at any critical point in the life cycle of building a PKI. So to start, we're gonna take our fictitious tech corp here, and it's really a small company that grows into a surprising success, right? So our story here. It's founded in Baltimore, Maryland by three friends from college, like these tech startups are. They launched their software service. They had 4 employees, including one IT professional who was the head of security. And this was kind of their tech go-to, the person in the company that everybody looks at for tech. Her name's Tina. And so we're going to kind of follow Tina's journey as this technology and as PKI unfolds. So as head of IT security at this firm, Tina has 2 tasks on her plate in 2008. So we're kind of time boxing this. She's looking at securing internal servers and services and looking at signing code, right? And so these are things oftentimes people look at for PKI. Also, they're a startup, so money's tight. Company has modest ambitions, kind of given their market size. So Tina goes out there, she's ambitious, and she heads home, and over the weekend she's Googling and she figures out that, well, Microsoft Certificate Services, a free CA, it's on her machine already. And she gets to work and she sets up virtual machines, gets it running, and works. And after a bunch of iterations, she's figured it out. And now Tina's got a working CA. So, Tina, following on the story, she's back in the office after the weekend, and she issues her first certificates off her newly issued root in the name of Tech Corp, and she's the hero. The internal servers are protected, and the developers can sign their code. So looking at what Tina did, kind of binding this back into PKI, she's really solved creating a PKI administrator, creating a root CA, and getting the signed code and the certificates issued to the servers like she decided. But how did she do this? And that's what we're going to talk about here in a little more detail. So from a lessons learned perspective, at this point, somebody just starting a CA and going home and Googling and figuring it out, I think this is where Andrew and I had some fun in creating this deck, was just talk about the things we see out there with customers. And kind of ordered on the screen here. I think number one, big step was missed here. Planning your CA hierarchy and revocation configurations. Do you have a root in issuing CA, end entity certs, multiple issuing CAs, multiple roots? There's a lot of decisions that can happen. Oftentimes the simplest is easiest. But then, revocation comes into this too. So are you going to set up a way for people to revoke certs? Do you have infrastructure to support that? There's challenges in there. Drew, do you want to kind of talk about some of those challenges a little bit?
Absolutely. So, you hit on two really good points so far, right? So CA hierarchy. Are we talking about a two-tier? In this case, so far we've talked about a single tier, a single root. Two-tier being, that of a root and an issuing. And a three-tier being, a root, a policy, and an issuing tier. And then, what are the advantages and disadvantages of each?
Right.
And what is applicable to your environment, right? If you're a huge global company, maybe you do want a three-tier PKI because you have, global concerns about or constraints, encryption constraints or, certificate constraints that are specific to a geographic location, such as, China or the European Union. And then your revocation configuration, right? How are people going to check, the revocation status of your certs to make sure that they're valid, that they haven't been revoked? And if you don't plan those things from the beginning, you're going to find that there are some pitfalls. Right.
And one of those pitfalls, coming to point number two, Andrew, is, as we've seen, sometimes people start these CAs and they do it without a hardware security module. And we thought for folks that are newer here, this would be a good time to talk about what that is, right? And so this is basically a very secure way to protect that private key for your PKI in hardware, and making sure that people can't just gain access to it. They can't use it. They can't steal it. It's really the foundational mark of a secure PKI, often a step that can be skipped when people roll their own. And we put three examples up here, right? Because an HSM, kind of to demystify it, you can get them in a USB form factor on the left of your screen there. You just put it into your USB slot and go. And you can get it in a network attached or a physical, kind of rack mount configuration like the center. Obviously, there's different capabilities and skill sets required for all these things. And then on the right of the slide, you can actually get cloud HSMs and cloud providers, Azure, IBM, whoever, and have storage of your keys securely in that manner too. And there's a lot of decisions. I don't think we'll unpack them all here, but you can get into a lot of different ways of managing HSMs. But the point is, securely store your key.
Absolutely, and I can't emphasize how critical this is, right? To create that high assurance, or even any type of assurance for your PKI, an HSM is a critical step, right? And a lot of people either are just confused by them, don't understand what they are, don't understand how they work, but that's where your HSM is literally the foundation of your PKI for determining the assurance and security of your PKI, so that you're not storing your CA keys in software.
Yeah. And that brings us nicely into the next two bullet points, which is, when you're doing this, when you're creating these keys, when you're creating the CA, it should be, even if you're doing it for yourself, it should be a process that would be auditable, right? And that doesn't mean necessarily you have external audits, but it means you have a way to say, we did this securely. We had controls over the keys. They weren't, created on somebody's iPhone and imported in there, and they're out in the wild and 10 people have them. And this is why identifying people who can manage those keys and use the recovery processes for them that are allowed, and documenting how it was created, that key generation ceremony document to say how this infrastructure was put together, then also leads into, well, how you back up that CA, the things that are issued in the database, as well as the keys, and store them. All of that comes into being able to capture that from the onset, and move that information forward.
And then the last point I think is really critical as well, right? Which is keep your root CA offline. Now, in the example that we've used so far, that's not the case, right? She only has a single tier, so of course it can't be offline, which, you know, in my opinion, is a mistake. You keep your root CA offline. You disable the network adapters in your BIOS, and the reason you do that is if your root's compromised, all of the CAs that it's signed, so if you have a 2-tier or a 3-tier, all of those CAs have to be re-signed, and then all of the certificates that have been issued by them have to be reissued. That's a huge undertaking, right? It can be extremely painful. So, you know, keeping your root CA offline, using an HSM, those are big items with your root CAs.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So you can see it got deep quick, right? It's in security. There's a lot to do to make sure that your PKI is secure. And this is kind of the foundational step. As we move forward and as Tina's company grows, we'll kind of see what else happens here. So let's move forward. So Tina's Tech Corp, you know, time moves on, kind of fast forward. She gets to be named one of the top 25 startups out there. The company's successful, it's growing. And they're moving forward. They're, you know, creating new products and services. As they're doing that, they decide to open a new company headquarters in Texas. Little nod to where I live. Hello from Austin. So they now have 2 locations, more engineers, more space, 50 employees. The company is growing like you would see. As this company is growing, so are the security use cases. And from a best practice perspective, she realizes, well, she wants to separate the security of the PKI for the 2 offices with 2 different issuing CAs. And so, you know, we talked about in the first step, kind of deciding what your hierarchy is. She kind of missed that step. So now she's got to rebuild trust hierarchy, reissue the certificates because she didn't do that. But, you know, what she really wants to do as she's getting these 2 offices is she wants to secure and simplify access to wireless networking, and use workstation authentication certificates for people to gain access to the secure bits of her infrastructure as they're creating and managing these products. Pretty standard use case that we see out there. So this is kind of now what her PKI looks like. We've got the CAs, we've got the PKI servers, her as a PKI administrator. Remember, she's kind of jack of all trades. But now she's doing the servers, the signing, code signing, and she's got the wireless access points. So she's got a more complex CA hierarchy, and using PKI across, you know, now multiple offices. So from a lesson learned perspective, at this phase of growth, what we're looking at is now as she's created new issuing CAs, and any time in a PKI you create new issuing CAs, you're creating a key. And so you want to have a key ceremony like we talked about in the last slide. You want to document that process and ensure that you're not only documenting it, but doing it securely, protecting that key in the HSM, making sure that it's never in clear text and nobody has sole access to it. Doing that, you want to ensure that you're using something like a network-based HSM with your issuing CA keys. And I think this is important. Andrew, you want to kind of talk to that one a little bit?
Sure. So, I mean, network-based HSMs, the wonderful thing about them is you could have multiple partitions, you know, for each of your issuing CAs. And you could even have, you know, a single pair, as an example, sitting in a centralized data center, feeding multiple geographic locations if necessary. So they're incredibly useful for issuing CAs, right? And that's their purpose, right? So a network-based HSM is really focused on your issuing, or, you know, even your policy CA if you're doing, you know, a 3-tier environment, which is uncommon, but anything that other than the root. The root should have an offline USB-based or, you know, some other form of offline HSM. But your issuing CAs, your policy, they can all use network-based HSMs. And depending on your budget for your PKI, you can consolidate those, or you can create redundancy by having multiple network-based HSMs in multiple geographic locations to create a failover, right? The software that comes with them. So an HSM is not just hardware; it's also software that you install on your CAs, and that's an important point, because that software does the load balancing, for lack of a better term, between your network-based HSMs to tell it which is currently active and assigned to which of your certification authorities. So you can create redundancy is basically what I'm getting at there, by using the software that's provided with the HSMs in multiple geographic locations or multiple data centers that way.
Yeah. And as we're doing that, to point 3 here, you want to make sure you have backups of these keys, right? You're starting to think about point 4, the disaster recovery plan. You've got multiple locations, a bunch of employees now, a bunch of different use cases, some secure secrets you're managing. So ensuring that you're able to back up those keys and do it securely, and then secure those backups in a way that in a DR plan, you can test it, right? And I think this is one of the important things of a DR plan, not just creating one for the auditor and saying, yeah, we have it, but being able to actually test it, go through it, recover those keys, ensure that, if keys are distributed amongst different key holders or portions, multiple parties are required to resurrect that key. Can you actually go through the DR plan to pull those people back together on a weekend, Saturday morning, within a certain time frame, to reconstruct those keys, distribute them through your network-based HSM infrastructure, and get your system back up and running? That there's a lot that has to happen in there, and ensuring you can do that, have that plan, and test it and go through it, I think is super critical. Anything to add to that, Andrew?
No, I think you covered it well.
Okay, so then moving into the last one, and this is interesting, right? So the company's growing. There's multiple employees, multiple locations, probably some contractors involved. We started out and it was kind of Windows centric. Does this business now have Mac, people using Mac OS? Is there Linux desktops? Are they supporting bring your own device and people accessing company services and systems that way? These are all interesting considerations as you grow, because as you want to use that PKI to access, the wireless networking in her use case, or to sign code or server or desktop authentication, there's different ways that those certs get onto those environments. Some of it can be out of the box with some solutions. Some you need maybe some third-party help or custom things to do, but it's not necessarily straightforward that you just get to use PKI everywhere. Oftentimes, it's kind of a Swiss Army knife. You got to put a bunch of tools together to make that work. And I think multi-OS environments and the considerations there start certainly as the company grows. Okay.
And just to add to that, Ryan, real quickly, so in a Microsoft world, as an example, right? If you're doing auto enrollment, that's great for Windows-based systems, right? So yes, we can push workstation authentication certs via group policy through auto enrollment. But when you get into a Mac or a Linux-based environment, depending on whether those systems are joined to Active Directory or not, which is possible to join them, obviously, right, with today's tools, but they may not be able to enroll, and are very likely, I can almost guarantee you, they will not be able to use auto enrollment unless there is some type of a third-party tool that you're using to support that. So how are those people going to enroll for certificates? It's an important question.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Okay. So let's move forward with Tina's company as it is growing even more. So now her company has got more staff, more money coming in because they're solving bigger problems. And along with this increase in revenue comes that increase in staff. So now Tina, she's juggling a bunch of things, right? She's the jack of all trades. Now she has an IT team, which is good, and she's needing to balance her team spending between desktop and service IT to those who can manage web security and that have expertise in PCI. They're dealing with payment card security. So she decides that she'll assign the PCI part to one of her new team members, an IT generalist who will learn PKI ops on the job. As part of the new role, Tina is offloading the work of managing certificates. Up until now, everything has been manual. With each new internal user, she'd issue the certs they needed for them and their devices. So this is where proper management's important. You start to consider things like when people leave the organization, are you revoking access? She's getting into a more complex state of management. And so, as she's kind of transitioning this work to this employee, now you start to figure out, well, is the operations and procedures around the PKI in a state to be transitioned to somebody? Have we done these things properly? From a PKI perspective, now this complexity comes in. Now she's got not just PKI administrators, but maybe PKI operations people, dealing with key management, maybe dealing with, some of the back-end revocation services and stuff. And then people dealing with the policies and procedures and training around this. How is that going to work, right? This just got more complex, right? She's trying to scale herself, scale her business, and complexities come in. So as we look at the lessons learned and considerations at this phase of the growth, I think to outline this in this transition in this growth, it's a really, really good time to ensure PKI operations processes are documented. And what does that mean? That means how are keys stored? How are they recovered? How are they backed up? How are they generated? What's your lifecycle management on those keys? Also, what's your lifecycle management on the hardware? Like Drew was talking about earlier, there's the software component, hardware components of HSM. All of these things, need to ensure you have like IT process documents around how you're managing that. And that's kind of goes into bullet point number 2, ensure that those IT processes that are relying on PKI are also documented, right? So in number 1, we're talking about the PKI operations itself. In number 2, we're saying, to Andrew's point earlier, we could have third-party systems or auto-enrollment or different things relying on the PKI to get those certificates to users to be usable. Is that documented somewhere? Do people understand that that's happening and how to, in a DR perspective, bring that back online? How those systems are actually integrated, what those touch points are. Super critical.
I think to add to that, Brian, so each tier of your PKI has a lifetime, right? So it's set during initial configuration. So your root may have a 10-year life, as an example. Your issuing may have a 5-year life, and sometime before that, that lifetime has expired, you need to renew that CA. So 10 years, as an example for your root, it's a long time for an IT employee to be with the company.
Right.
So more than likely, that person has left. Somebody else has replaced them. Do they know how to renew that certificate, that CA certificate? Because if they don't, the PKA will stop working when the lifetime of that CA expires, as well as all the certificates that are attached to it. So all of the applications and internal business processes that are leveraging those systems are now going to also stop potentially working, or at least a portion of them, authentication or whatever it may be that you're using that cert for. So making sure that your PKI operations are documented is really a critical task.
Yeah, and that nicely rolls into our third item here. That at this point, we're going to throw 3 kind of concepts at you here, but let's unpack them for a second. Do you have a policy management authority? Can you create that around the policies that are being managed in your PKI and a group of people that are enforcing those and contributing to how that's done, which then nicely tucks into the key custodians, the people who have the responsibility and have, again, mapped up through that policy how they're managing those keys. And then last but not least, trusted individuals. And that could be different than key custodians. Trusted individuals can be the people who have the material to recover keys, to reassemble them, have materials to manage backups. Again, maybe this is where the quorum of N of M people need to come together to do an activity. But you need to start defining these roles and policies. Again, like Andrew was just talking about, just to be able to support the IT processes, like we talked about earlier, support the DR processes of what's happening. There's a lot of good reasons to make sure you have a very well documented PKI, as well as lanes for the people operating that are managing it, and defined roles for what people are doing.
And let me just comment here, Brian. So a policy management authority, that sounds super official, right? And it is to some degree, right? I mean, it's a documented role. But what that really means, right, is it's a group of people within the organization that decide, what your PKI in its entirety is made up of. So what certs it's going to issue, how many CAs, how many tiers, and really this is one of the things that you want to begin forming at the beginning, because in order to successfully design your PKI, you need that policy management authority there to make those decisions. Otherwise, they're just accepting those decisions, and then they're going to move forward with any changes that need to be documented, and as things change within the organization. Your key custodians, those are the people that, with your HSMs as an example, right? They're the ones that have the M of N keys. So typically they're USB-based keys. They're used to re-sign your CA or to issue the initial certificate and keys for your CA. There's multiple people, so that it creates a separation of duty, and that one person can't come in and execute a task by themselves.
Yeah, super important.
It is really important, and it's a typical task in a PKI, that you're trying to formalize and get some type of assurance level with.
Yeah, and to reflect on what Andrew was just saying is that fourth item, that there's, again, two more terms here that's maybe new to some folks, but a certificate policy or a certificate practice statement. If there's not one in place at this point, you probably want to consider that. And what these are, effectively, is just documentation around what the certificates do, what's in the certificates, and then how you're managing that environment and outlining these processes and these roles and that management over the PKI to ensure it's done correctly. Now, there's some external industry standards that require, in some cases, people have these. In the most part, these wouldn't apply to you folks. That would be standing up kind of a freeware CA or a DIY CA, but it's still a great practice to ensure that your CA is recoverable and that it is scalable and that you can rely on it for business critical functions as your organization grows. These two documents are great ways to kind of codify that and move your organization forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these documents are important, right? They are difficult to write, right? Let's be honest. They're very long. There are actual sections of legal statements in here. You'll have to potentially get approved by your legal team, as well as compliance. And it actually forms your PMA, your policy management authority, in these documents. But there are templates out there, right? So NIST provides a really good template, for this use case for certificate policy and certificate practices. And obviously that, you can always bring in outside help to help you write these as well, because they do kind of create the foundation of your PKI.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Andrew. I think that's critical and important, and we've both seen in our DigiCert and DXT tracks a lot of work in the CP and CPS area and helping customers with this. And it is oftentimes confusing, but I think it's critical to help people move their business forward. Okay, so let's jump forward with Tina, back to her story and what's happening now. She's made some unfortunate decisions, poor Tina, on her road to success. Up until this point, she has not taken the advice we've talked through and some of the recommendations, and she's had her keys managed on her local servers, not in HSMs. Now, if you remember back to even our first slide, we suggested that's a very bad thing. Well, she's now, as she's grown, realized that that is a bad thing, and she wants to get her keys located in HSM. So she, gets the budget, obtains some HSMs, and these can be, depending on what you get, very inexpensive to extremely expensive. There's all kinds of throughput requirements, things like that. We'll get into that in a second. But the roots are important, right? And so now she wants to get these HSMs and she wants to physically lock them in a room, get them in a locked separate cage from the rest of the data center, and ensure they're getting the security and safety that they need. And so because of that now, she also needs to have some different staff on hand to hold secure portions of the key material as she's provisioning these HSMs like we talked about earlier. And a person who has the ability to go in and know PKI enough to do things that would require operations on that root certificate, right? So she's kind of splitting out more roles. She also needs to make sure that there's separate duties and controls like we were talking about. And so in the industry, we call that M of N controls, where you split access across many people. Maybe like N is 6 people, and so maybe 4, which is the M, need to represent or be present. So 4 of the 6 need to be present to create a thing like an ICA or to operate and enroll a new HSM. So she's doing these activities, and they've also moved to a new moved an HSM, and now they need to generate a new PKI hierarchy because they've brought new HSMs in. So new routes, new ICAs, the whole thing. Because now she wants to securely manage and generate this route. This is what we were talking about earlier. If you don't generate it securely at the start, and then as Tina at this point is now realizing, oh my gosh, I want this secure, and HSMs means it's secure, and my business is dependent on this, you may have to restart the whole thing at this point because you can't attest that that route was secure up to this point. So Tina's kind of found herself into an interesting situation as she's moving forward. From her PKI perspective, this now looks like in that dotted line that she's got the CA still. She's kind of got the same people and processes and services on the exterior, but now she's starting to say, well, how can I do these activities of this management and administration of my CA where I have HSMs now locked in cages and I require multiple parties to do these things and maybe multiple parties to recover things from the database. So some complexity happens for her in trying to figure out how to really properly manage the security around this CA.
Well, and I think to comment on one of those points, Brian, how is she going to get the existing keys into the HSM, right? So if she doesn't want to reissue all the certificates that have been issued to this point, right? And she wants to use HSMs, how's she going to get those keys imported in there? Now, there are tools to do that, right? But again, if you want a higher assurance level for your CA, you want to, guarantee that key pair has never been compromised. Is that the right choice?
Yeah.
Should you transport the existing keys, or should you, now, because you're going to use HSMs, basically reissue your root and your issuing CA certificates with the HSM and securely store them, but then you're going to have to reissue all the certs that have been issued so far. And that's a problem potentially, right? I mean, it could be a very big problem depending on how many certificates you've issued.
That's right. Yeah, and again, back to the BYOD and multi-OS, that problem amplifies itself if you have more clients dependent on that and variables and how those certs are deployed and third-party dependent infrastructure. And ideally, you don't want to make that mistake. So at this point in her journey, and as we're looking forward at this, what are the lessons learned and considerations here? So number one, how are you going to scale your PKI issuance to meet your needs, right? Our organization is much larger here, but so is the complexity for the PKI systems and the management of it. And there's this balance, right? There's a procedural portion of the solution, there's a technology portion of the solution, and there's a security portion of the solution that you need to balance. And as you're issuing more certificates and having more infrastructure and having more employees, all of those things scale and compound. And you start getting into question two or item two there, revocation, right? PKI, like we talked about earlier, is probably not very useful if you can't revoke, if you can't, deny the trust of the thing that has the certificate. And so how are you actually managing that revocation infrastructure? Do you need publicly accessible URLs? And this is a big mistake Andrew and I were talking about in prep for this, where folks will create a CA and roll it up really quickly, and then not even think they'll put an internal path for CRLs because it's on an internal server or something along those lines. And then when they start using it outside of their corporate firewall, now they're in trouble. And that CA infrastructure needs to be redone because the CRLs weren't thought of appropriately at the onset. And I think, Drew, you had some other interesting items on revocation as well. Do you want to kind of chat about some of those?
Sure. So, I mean, absolutely what you said, right? And when people think of publicly accessible CRLs, is that something you really want to do with an internal PKI? The answer is potentially, right? So we've actually done it many times. Typically the use case is something like SCCM, or in this case it would be IBCM, Internet-Based Configuration Manager, where you are you're pushing patches, or you're doing Windows deployments to mobile clients that never come into an office, as an example. So in that scenario, they're using workstation authentication certs to authenticate them to the configuration manager distribution points, and there's a need to have a publicly accessible CRL to determine revocation status. So can you do that securely with an internal PKI? Yes, you can, right? But going back to the previous point, you need to have, I should say you don't need to have, you want to have, from a security perspective, publicly based DNS names assigned to your CRLs. So in your CRL configuration in your CA, you're actually going to assign DNS aliases to your servers and use those as your CRL revocation points, your CDPs or AIAs.
Yeah.
Rather than the actual server names themselves. That way you're not disclosing that information to the internet, as an example.
Yeah.
And then, one thing we hear often is, LDAP. Should you use LDAP for, as a CDP? And the answer is, well, I would recommend that you don't, but it is feasible. LDAP was never really meant to be a CDP. Does it work in a Microsoft world? Yes. Is it the best scenario? No. Right. The best scenario is a web server hosting your CRL or OCSP. And with OCSP, it's not even possible to use LDAP. You can only do it with the CRL. So should you use LDAP? In my short answer is no, in my opinion, right? So back to you, Brian.
Yeah, no, those are great points. Thanks, Andrew. I think the last bullet we have here, as this is scaling, is, how is Tina, how are you performing certificate lifecycle management operations at this point? And this is a common thread we see, right? Especially with Microsoft CA, where there's not necessarily the management tools. A lot of people default to Excel and trying to track expirations and issuance and revocations. And they start to kind of cobble things together to figure out how they're going to manage those certificates. And I think that gets magnified as people are integrating these third-party systems on top of it. And you maybe lose sight of some of the automated provisioning and your ability to even find and locate a certificate that you think is of interest, that becomes complicated, and that becomes troublesome fast. And Andrew, I know you've seen a bunch in here too, so feel free to add that.
Absolutely. I mean, so Microsoft doesn't have any default tools for managing certificates once they've been issued, right? I mean, yes, you're able to go and kind of sort through the database manually, and you can sort by serial number or by, if you're using, an email address or, UPN or something, depending on what type of cert it is.
Right.
But I mean, that's painful, right? It really is painful. So you're kind of defaulting to Excel. So, what do you do for certificate management? Do you bring in, a third-party product? And those products are typically expensive, right? They're very good at what they do, very good. But those are things to consider, right? Or you're going to use, a spreadsheet, or you're going to use some type of a third-party tool to do that certificate lifecycle management.
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned, Brian, when somebody leaves the company, right? How do you go revoke that certificate? If you're using just the default tools, you're going to do, go find it by serial number if you know it, or by their username, or whatever it may be. Find it, revoke it. But that may take, 30, 40, an hour to find it and revoke it, depending on how many certs you've issued.
Yeah. So tooling is important. All right, so let's move forward with Tina and her journey, and this is kind of the last stop on Tina's journey. So now, her company has just been this overnight success, multiple product lines, grown to multiple regions and offices, and the software is being used extensively, and so there's a lot of demand for signing operations. The HSM has now grown to requirements of multiple HSMs, and that's because, right, they have a limited volume of transactions they can perform. They're doing cryptographic operations. They want to be doing them securely, and so she now needs more of these and clusters of these HSMs to support these operations. And now think about that. She has to do that while simultaneously allowing new HSMs to be brought online, back to our roles and individuals and key custodians, but then also M&N quorums to get material into HSMs, and then getting those HSMs physically into data center, but into the cage and separating them and providing the security controls around them, locked room, locked cage ordeal. There's more complexity to these things. But she needs to scale that with the issuance and the usage of what's happening. And so, she wants to make sure she's doing this the right way and managing this PKI properly. So as we look forward at the PKI now, right, it's become much more kind of elaborate, right? You have this secure facility, kind of that central box, the HSMCA's PKI servers and databases kind of sitting in a secure facility. But then, a DR site, right? Like kind of taking that stuff, replicating that, and making sure you have that somewhere else, right? Like let's introduce that in here, and that facility being secure and managing this infrastructure. Now, this doesn't mean, you're building a physical location, right? It means you have maybe some colo and have a cage and a secure area in that colo, and you have your HSMs and your servers, and we're not implying that every organization needs to go build a data center. That's not what it is. But you do need to have physical controls and security around it. And if it's not in a data center or facility you're managing, it's likely going to be in a colo or somebody else's, where you can get that kind of degree of security. And a lot of organizations offer that from a server kind of hosting perspective. And so at this point in growth, right, there's some interesting things that happens as well. And this kind of brings us to our last stop on the journey of considerations. And I think these are interesting, and you can get here fast, right? Like I don't want the folks listening here to think, oh, I'd never get to this scale. I think Andrew and myself, as we were talking about this, we see like a lot of companies get into this phase where the PKI usage, as they start to scale it out and start to get it onto end user devices and workstations, and now all of a sudden every user has multiple certificates for different devices and BYOD and use cases, it can get quite high. And then, right, so how am I managing that kind of automated issuance? You know, the proverbial everybody shows up at 9 a.m. Monday morning, or at least we used to, turns on their machines, and everybody needs to get issued a new certificate because, you know, that's the day things are coming online. The other side of that high volume is revocation, right? So you probably have more systems, maybe data centers you're using certificates in from machine to machine, right? How do those things get revoked? And can you support that revocation infrastructure at scale, and provide the level of service that your company needs? You know, Drew, do you want to talk about anything else in the high volume category?
No, I think you've covered it. I mean,
perfect. So, you know, the second bucket then, automation of certificate installation and configuration. This is a hot one, right? Like Andrew was talking about auto enrollment earlier, Active Directory auto enrollment to get certificates out to, you know, Windows connected machines, and that's a great thing. But there's other devices, other infrastructure, other servers. Maybe you have a CI/CD environment that you're using certificates for mutual authentication between containerized workloads, right? There's a lot of things that can rely on PKI to make them authenticated and safe. And you're going to find out real quickly, if you don't have automated processes around the certificate installation and configuration, it's going to become unmanageable very, very quickly. And you know, there's a lot of different point solutions. I think Andrew was talking about some of that earlier, to help in there, but this is definitely an area to explore, I think, even earlier than we did in this story, in this narrative, because the more automation you can provide around this, the easier that PKI is going to be to use, and you're going to find greater value out of it.
well, and you're taking, you know, the human error margin out of it, right? So, you know, when you're replacing a certificate on a server, removing that human factor, you know, it may not have been the person who originally did it. They may not even be familiar with how to replace the certificate on that web server or, you know, that cloud application. So being able to automate it makes that much, much simpler, right? And again, you know, less error prone.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's a general movement out there for crypto agility, to allow people to respond to changes in PKI standards very quickly. Automation obviously helps you get there fast. And I think the next point, multi-step DR and recovery and backup, we kind of talked about earlier. I think you know, just the lesson learned here is, you know, as that PKI scales in complexity, you know, you got to make sure you're updating that DR plan. You got to make sure, if you're getting multi-site, that you're able to do these things across those multiple centers and support backups, and just make sure it all works, right? That plan and strategy has to scale with the PKI and with the business. And then I think the fourth item here is super interesting, and people don't think about this often, but if you have a CA and you start using it, and you maybe issue a route that's a 10-year route for your business, is that machine it's running on going to be capable to be running in 10 years? Is that operating system going to be upgradable and supported still in 10 years? Is the CA software going to be, you know, upgraded and supportable? What about the HSM software and hardware? Is it going to be end of life? Is it going to be upgrade? Right. So there's this whole path of making sure you're making you're caring for the infrastructure of the PKI at that, you know, the OS and HSM level, and making sure that for the duration of that CA, the thing will be operable, and you'll be able to maintain it and move it forward and upgrade it. Okay, let's dive into the next slide. So we're going to kind of wrap up Tina's journey here, and conclude kind of where she's gone. This is kind of looking at her journey in a little different perspective, right? So that box that we've put around the infrastructure is the managed PKI box, and we've kind of separated that out from the PKI administrators and the use cases on the left, how certs are being consumed from the PKI. I think the kind of point we're making here is that, from a PKI perspective, as the complexity grows and dependence and reliance on it increases, you want to make sure that you can provide the right kind of infrastructure. And it can be complex, especially to do it correctly, and it can be costly to do it correctly. And so, when you look at the PKI aspects, you can also look at a managed PKI provider. DXC does this, DigiCert does this. We both provide services in this category, so we're well aware of all of the things that we've been suggesting to you, because we do them ourselves. And this is how we're managing things. And so you're able to offload all of those tasks we were talking about and all of those considerations and rely on somebody else to take care of that core aspect for you, and then be able to use those, consume those in your environments, and that includes even things like we mentioned earlier, the CPCPS, and some of those other kind of foundational documents around how things are created. It's nice to have somebody that can help you in that building of the CA. Defining those root hierarchies, training your staff, connecting these things to different third-party and cloud services, managing the HSMs. If you don't have to deal with that, that's probably awesome. Dealing with key activities and recovery and just making that black box. The DR processes, the CRL and OCSP services and operations, making sure that's working. And just making sure that the system is generally available. So this is really at the heart of what managed PKI providers provide in this space. Do you want to add anything to that, Andrew?
I mean, the only thing I would add is, obviously, yeah, you're absolutely right. Managed PKI providers, they do this incredibly well, right? And you don't necessarily have some of the additional expenses such as HSMs, because they're providing those things virtually for you, right? If you are going to do it yourself, you are going to buy the hardware, and you want to manage it yourself, right? But you don't have all of the expertise in-house, you could always also bring in some outside help, somebody with PKI expertise to help you do some of these things that we've talked about, such as write a CPCPS, integrate your, create a design first of all, and then integrate your CAs with your HSMs, help you, create your certificate templates as an example, right? So should you be using, V1, V2, V3 templates, depending on what the use case is, how to create your certificate revocation, as we talked about, quite a bit as well, and to do, to help you plan your disaster recovery planning.
Yeah. Perfect. So let's jump forward. Here's the next one. I think that the last slide that we have here before we jump into Q&A is some of the consideration of use cases. We've talked through some things. Andrew's talked through some different use cases, and as have I in the Tina story. But I think this is maybe a good summary of some of the things that we see people doing with PKI in this segment. And it's providing secure email, it's the Wi-Fi device authentication we talked about, secure remote access for VPNs, MDM, right, out to those BYOD devices, and managing those things, document signing of various degrees, authentication, network access controls, the smart card login use cases we talked about at the beginning, so physical access controls, some folks using this for SSL inspection inside their environment, and really PKI is very flexible. We help people do all sorts of other things with it. I think this is just a good general kind of launch port category. So as you're thinking about PKI, sometimes people get pigeonholed into thinking about one particular thing you can do. I think we just like to present this to let you know that it can be used in a lot of robust places for a lot of use cases. Okay, so with that, let's jump over to the Q&A, and I will stop sharing here for a second so you can hopefully see our faces. Let's go over here and let me see what kind of questions we have floating around. Context switching. Okay, it looks like we got a few questions here.
So let me address one. There was some apps require LDAP for serial lookup. It is up to the app. I don't disagree with you, right? If there is a requirement for LDAP, absolutely, if that's what you need to use it, right? It would not be my first recommendation to use LDAP, right? I would say, and most apps, if not, almost all, are able to use a web-based certificate revocation. So if you can use web-based, use it, because it is the most flexible and most widely used. LDAP, if it is an application that is specifically using LDAP, I mean, absolutely, no issues there.
Yeah, so it's great. I think let's grab another one of these questions I see here. So what managed PKI software is behind what DigiCert and DXC can provide? So I'll start with that on the DigiCert side, and then you want to take the DXC side, Andrew?
Sure.
Perfect. So on the DigiCert side, we have our own software, as you can imagine. As one of the world leading PKI providers, we've created infrastructure around that with our acquisition of the Semantic business a few years ago. We also got a whole bunch of other CAs and infrastructure in that. But we've been rolling forward with new horizontally cloud scalable, cloud native architectures as well, to be able to respond to multi-tenant needs of the industry. That same software we're also able to provide on-premise for customers and for managed service security providers to use and provide those services, enterprise or in-country or for their own use cases. So it's our own. It's kind of the short answer, but it's very flexible, and others can use it too. So Andrew, from the DXC side, do you want to talk about what you guys offer?
Sure. So I mean, we are at DXC. We are platform independent, right? Obviously we have a partnership with DigiCert. We can implement their managed PKI services. We can also implement tools like Venafi as an example, right? That does a very good job of some of the automation we talked about. So, I mean, it really depends on the customer's, situation. If they have the budget to do, managed PKI or Venafi for certificate management, and what are their needs, right? So all that's done during the course of the engagement that we would come and help you with your PKI, but to determine what is best of breed for your environment.
Yeah, very much a good service you guys are providing there as PKI experts to help guide people into the right path. So another question here that I think is interesting, and I'm going to kind of take it a little deeper than I think what is written here, is what sort of front end would you provide to remote users? And so I'm going to kind of take that to mean in our services, how do people interact with them between DXC and between DigiCert? And I think it's interesting because I split it into two categories, right? There's definitely user-facing enrollment services that we all want to provide, where you do want an end user involved in maybe cert pickup or request, and we provide different authenticated modes of that or unauthenticated modes to allow depending on the use cases for that class. But I think what's more interesting and what Andrew was just talking about is the automation side of things. And the fun part there is generally the user doesn't really know it's maybe even happening. The IT folks have configured something, a policy is pushed down, and the machines are doing these things, and the user doesn't need to know. I think those are the best kind of PKI because it's unseen and it's working really well. And in this space for enterprise kind of authentication, what we're talking about and some of these use cases, from the DigiCert side, we provide a lot of that deep automation. Andrew was mentioning Active Directory. So we have Active Directory auto enrollment. We have our own auto enrollment if Active Directory is not present. A bunch of solutions that allow the certs to get distributed in an automated way, but then also configure them for use in whatever the thing is that's using them. So it's pretty end to end. So I think ideally you want a lot of automation and less user involvement, unless the user involvement is additive to what you're trying to do. Andrew, did you want to add to that?
No, I think you covered it really well, actually.
Okay. One last question then. It says, I noticed that often OCSP and CDPs use HTTP, not HTTPS. Thoughts? Andrew, I'll let you lead that one.
Sure, no problem. So, I mean, so your CRLs have to use HTTP, right? It was never built for HTTPS. It is a standard that way. And is there a problem with that? I mean, there's debate, obviously, on both sides of that fence. Obviously, HTTP is much faster because you're not having to do the SSL handshake. Now, I mean, SSL handshake happens very quickly, but it does really, remove some overhead when you're doing CRL checking. For OCSP, right? Can you configure it with HTTPS? The answer is yes. Should you? No, right? It was not meant to be. Well, and that's not even necessarily true. I don't want to make that as a blanket statement, right? OCSP is typically not used with HTTPS. And the reason for that is, again, it goes back to the SSL handshake, right? Where do you issue the certificate from for the HTTPS? Is it issued from your internal PKI, or is it issued from a public, CA? There are, disadvantages potentially to having it SSL encrypted there. And since you're really only providing a list of revoked certificates, which is literally all a CRL is, which is a complete list of all certificates based on serial numbers that have been revoked, are you potentially exposing something, that's able to be intercepted because it's not an encrypted channel? Well, I mean, yes, but does it matter? Probably not. Right?
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Andrew and DXC, for loaning you to us. I think that's all the time we have. We're just a couple minutes over here. So I appreciate all the questions, and there's some we didn't get to, and people left emails here. We'll be sure to get back to you and answer those as well. So we appreciate your time today, and please follow up with us if you guys do need any help or have any questions. We'd love to help you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.